What if I told you that beneath one of the greatest empires in human history, a secret chapel still whispers the prayers of women who were never meant to be remembered? Women whose names were erased, whose voices were buried, yet whose final act of defiance was so powerful that it survived in silence for centuries. This episode drags you into the heart of their forgotten world, a world where peaceful convent walls were shattered by invading armies, where hymns turned into screams, where an unarmed sisterhood faced the unstoppable force of conquest and chose unwavering faith over life itself, captured and marched across distant lands as living proof of victory, stripped of identity and thrown into the sunless corridors beneath imperial palaces. They were expected to break, to beg, to surrender their God and their memories. Instead, they carved their faith into stone. They built a hidden chapel from dust and fragments. They prayed in secret when any whisper could cost them everything. And even as the empire tried to erase every trace of their existence, a blank space in official registers and a chamber filled with faint Christian carvings revealed the truth that no ruler could bury. This is the untold story of women who refused to kneel, who stood against an empire armed with nothing but their voices and their silence. A story so haunting and so fiercely human that once you hear the first sentence, you will not be able to stop until you discover how their final prayer echoed through the darkness and reached us across the centuries. The monastery had stood for centuries as a quiet sanctuary, its white walls glimmering in the early light, its bells echoing through forests and valleys. But on this day, that calm holiness turned into the trembling heart of a battlefield, because the approaching Ottoman army did not see a house of prayer. They saw a symbol of stubborn defiance, a challenge carved in stone, a cross daring to rise against the will of an empire that demanded silence. The soldiers moved with deliberate precision, their boots kicking up clouds of dust, their cannons positioned with ruthless intention. And for a brief moment, the nuns inside believed the walls might protect them. They believed that the sacred would hold until the first cannon roared with a thunder that split the sky itself. The ancient wooden gates exploded outward in a burst of splinters and smoke. The stones trembled beneath the force, the air filled with choking dust and the sharp smell of fire. The peaceful courtyard transformed into a fractured battlefield, prayers turning into gasps of terror, sunlight flickering through swirling smoke like the last breath of a dying world. The soldiers advanced without hesitation, pushing through the shattered entrance as though it were nothing more than a broken door to a forgotten barn. And every monkish carving, every delicate fresco, every sacred artifact became to them a symbol that needed to be crushed. Every sign of the cross felt like a challenge, a reminder that somewhere beyond the reach of their empire, another power still dared to exist. The nuns pressed together inside the chapel, clutching their small relics, silver chalices polished by years of devotion, embroidered icons stitched by trembling hands, fragments of saints' bones hidden beneath the floor where only faith could reach them. They prayed not for victory, but for endurance, their hearts pounding in unison with each cannon blast, the floor shuddering as though the entire building had begun to breathe in fear. Outside, the soldiers shouted for surrender, the sound cutting through the air like a knife. Yet the women inside held their ground, whispering their hymns in trembling voices, hoping their God would hear them through the storm. Another cannon blast followed, louder, closer, the walls groaning as cracks snaked across the ancient stones, dust drifting down like falling ash, the sky above darkening from smoke rather than clouds. The empire had no interest in preserving the holy or respecting the sacred. To them, this monastery was a spark that needed to be smothered, a reminder that conquered soil still carried the heartbeat of those who refused to bow, and every moment of resistance only intensified the fury of the attackers. Low rumbles filled the air as yet another cannonball tore through the wall, ripping away the calm of centuries. The earth itself seemed to exhale in shock, the once peaceful sanctuary becoming a ruin of shattered stone and terrified whispers. The soldiers stormed through the breach, their armor glinting in the dim haze. And for the sisters, this was the moment when the world shifted forever, the instant when their sacred home became a battlefield, and their faith the only weapon they had left, a weapon the invaders could not understand and could not truly destroy. The courtyard lay in ruins, the air thick with dust and the bitter metallic scent of smoke. Broken stones scattered like the bones of a fallen sanctuary. And in this shattered silence, the surviving sisters were driven forward by soldiers who expected terror, trembling, desperate pleas for mercy, the kind of chaos that always follows defeat. Yet what they found instead stopped even the hardened among them, for the women did not scream, they did not cry, they did not collapse before the shadow of the empire towering over them. They stood close together, robes torn, faces pale from exhaustion and fear, but their eyes filled with something the soldiers could not decipher, something that did not belong on a battlefield. When the torches were raised, throwing restless gold across the courtyard, a single voice rose from the group, faint at first, almost fragile, like a candle flickering against a rising storm. Then another joined, and another, until the entire courtyard filled with the haunting melody of a hymn the soldiers had heard only in distant churches, the ancient words of Agnus Dei floating upward through smoke and ruin, a prayer not of surrender, but of defiance, their voices shaking yet refusing to break. The Ottoman captain hesitated, unsure if he was witnessing courage or madness. His men looked at one another with unease, because this was not how captives behaved. No cries for pity, no attempts to bargain for life, only a rising tide of sacred song that wove itself through the night air like a final breath of a world refusing to die. In the center of the group stood the abbess, her posture straight. Despite the bruises on her hands, her fingers curled around a silver cross rescued from the collapsing chapel, its surface tarnished by smoke yet gleaming fiercely in the torchlight. She did not hide it, she did not lower it, she held it as though it were the last unbroken piece of their world. The captain stepped toward her and, in a strained attempt at mercy, promised life in exchange for silence, for obedience, for the simple act of letting go of the faith she clutched so tightly. He believed fear would bend her, he believed despair would break her, yet she lifted her chin slightly, her eyes steady despite the armies surrounding her, and she answered with a calmness that unsettled even the wind moving through the ruined arches. She said that she had already given her life, and asked what more they believed they could take from her. The moment her words drifted into the smoke, the courtyard seemed to hold its breath. Even the soldiers faltered, for the phrase did not sound like a plea. It sounded like a verdict already accepted, a truth no empire could rewrite. That single sentence passed from soldier to soldier, from witness to witness, until it grew into legend. The story of a woman who stood singing while the world collapsed around her, the story of a faith that refused to kneel even when the earth itself trembled, and long after the torches died and the courtyard emptied, the echo of her voice remained, carried by the night, refusing to be silenced. The journey toward the port began before dawn, a thin line of exhausted women stumbling across a barren landscape that once felt familiar and safe, but now seemed endless, hostile, stripped of mercy. The sisters moved in silence, their wrists bound with coarse rope, their habits torn by days of marching, their steps heavy with hunger and despair, the only sound around them the rhythmic clatter of hooves and the sharp whistles of guards, urging them forward. For 7 days, they walked under a relentless sun that burned their faces and blinded their eyes. Nights brought little comfort, only cold winds creeping through their thin garments, their world shrinking to dust, pain, and the distant dream of a sanctuary that no longer existed. As they neared the coast, the scent of salt reached them first, a faint reminder of a world beyond their suffering. But the moment they saw the port, their hope collapsed. The harbor of Volos stretched before them, crowded with traders shouting prices, sailors unloading crates, merchants waving ledgers stained with ink. It was a place of commerce, movement, and calculation, and into this world of weights and measurements the sisters were delivered like livestock. The guards ushered them through the crowd, heads turning as people saw the unusual procession of pale, silent women bound together. Some whispered prayers, others looked away in discomfort, yet no one intervened because in this place, value was measured in coin, not compassion. At the edge of the dock, a large Ottoman vessel awaited, its hull darkened by years of storms, its deck lined with ropes, barrels, and wooden crates marked with symbols of distant lands. The officer responsible for cargo appeared with a ledger clutched in his hand, his quill already dipped in ink. He asked no questions, offered no greeting. He merely observed the sisters with clinical detachment, then began writing. Spices from the east, textiles from the south, coin reserves for distribution, bags of grain, and then, with the same calm strokes, religious captives. His quill did not tremble, his expression did not shift, because for him these women were not souls to be saved or mourned. They were part of the shipment, another entry in the meticulous machinery of empire. The soldiers guided the sisters onto the ship, forcing them down narrow ramps into a dim hold that smelled of salt and damp wood. The space was cramped, ropes coiled like sleeping snakes, chains clinking under the movement of the tide. Above them, the gulls cried freely, while the sisters were swallowed by shadows as the anchor was raised and the ship creaked into motion. The coastline of Greece began to fade, their familiar world shrinking into a thin line, dissolving into the mist. The women sat in silence, listening to the waves strike the hull like a slow, relentless drum. They did not know that centuries later the only proof of their existence would be a single dry line of ink in an Ottoman registry, a cold entry among spices and coins, a record that historians would one day uncover and realize that what once seemed a legend had indeed left a trace, faint, fragile, but real, a whispered truth preserved not through compassion, but through paperwork. The palace did not roar with anger, nor echo with the wild fury of a battlefield. Instead, it breathed with the cold and measured silence of an empire that knew its power, an empire that did not need to shout to crush the will of those brought before it. The sisters were led through narrow corridors polished by centuries of footsteps, past marble pillars veined with gold and mosaics shimmering like frozen stars. The grandeur of the place felt like a warning, a whisper reminding them that here their voices meant nothing. When they were forced to their knees in the vast council hall, the air grew heavier, the room illuminated by tall windows, where thin beams of morning light stretched across the floor like pale, merciless fingers. At the far end sat the imperial council, known as the divan, a semicircle of high officials robed in deep colors, their expressions carved from stone, their eyes studying the kneeling women not with curiosity or cruelty, but with the distant analytical calm of judges reviewing a list of punishments. To the sisters, these men seemed almost unreal, more like statues shaped by the empire itself than living beings. The hall smelled faintly of ink, wax, and cold marble, a scent that spoke of records, decrees, and decisions that shaped the fates of nations. The guards stepped back, leaving the women exposed beneath the distant gaze of the council, and a translator stepped forward to speak the message that had been delivered in the same tone to countless others through generations. "The empire offers mercy," he said, "mercy in exchange for obedience, mercy in exchange for a new name, a new faith, a new life within the palace walls, where the forgotten are reshaped into servants of the conqueror, a place where those who submit may survive." This was not a plea, not a negotiation. It was a ritual of domination performed with chilling efficiency. The officials listened without moving, their silence louder than any threat. The women felt the weight of the offer settle on their shoulders, a choice that was not a choice at all, for to refuse meant disappearance, not loud or dramatic, but quiet, swift, swallowed by the palace's lower chambers where names dissolved into records stamped with a single word, unfit, a word that erased entire lives as easily as dust wiped from a table. The sisters exchanged glances, their fear trembling beneath the surface of their composure. Yet something steady glowed in their eyes, something the council had not expected. One of the officials shifted slightly, perhaps struck by the calmness radiating from women who had every reason to break. The translator repeated the offer with the same measured tone as if reciting a paragraph from an administrative decree. "Accept the empire's faith and live, reject it and vanish." No passion, no anger, only procedure. The empire did not need rage to enforce its will. It needed only structure, and structure it had, built over centuries, shaped by conquest and refined by the chilling logic that survival belonged only to those who surrendered their former selves. The sisters remained silent, their refusal not spoken aloud but carved into the stillness of the hall. Their silence was an answer. The divan understood, and the officials nodded faintly, like scholars completing a calculation. They signaled to the guards, and in that small gesture, the fate of the women shifted forever, not decided by a king, not blessed or condemned by a priest, but processed, categorized and marked by the hands of an empire that turned faith into a matter of administration, an empire that did not need to strike down the soul to conquer it, only to rewrite it. The descent into the underbelly of the palace began with a silence so heavy it felt like a chain around the women's throats. The guards marched them down narrow stone stairways carved centuries earlier, stairways that smelled of damp earth and forgotten secrets, their robes stripped away and replaced with coarse garments that scratched their skin. Each woman marked not by a name, but by a simple number, spoken with the cold efficiency of an accountant. They were no longer sisters, no longer daughters or teachers or singers of hymns. They had become entries in the lowest register of the palace, a category reserved for those who existed only to serve. The corridors they entered were dark and windowless, lit only by thin slits in the walls where dust floated like lost souls, suspended in stale light. The air trembled with the distant echoes of furnaces, the clatter of buckets, the scraping of brooms across ancient floors polished by countless forgotten hands. The women were assigned to tasks without ceremony. Wash these stones until they shine, carry wood to the fire pits, stitch garments until your fingers ache, serve without question, work without rest, pray without voice. The intention was clear: to strip them of identity, to swallow their sense of self in a labyrinth where even time seemed unsure of its own direction. Yet the empire underestimated them, for these women had already endured famine, captivity, and the shattering of their sanctuary. Hunger was familiar, cold was familiar, silence was familiar. They carried endurance in their bones, and slowly their suffering became something else. A quiet form of prayer, a discipline carved not into stone but into their own will. They worked with a calmness that unnerved the guards, their hands moving steadily, their faces composed. Even when exhaustion pressed against their ribs, they obeyed orders yet refused to crumble inward. The guards attempted to provoke them with questions, threats, commands delivered with impatience, but one evening a guard demanded that a woman speak her number. She lifted her head just slightly, her gaze steady, and answered with a voice soft as breath. "Call me Silence." The guard frowned, uncertain whether this was insolence or madness, but the woman did not look away, did not tremble. She simply repeated it. Silence. From that moment she no longer answered questions, and the other sisters followed her example. Soon the guards could not extract a word from any of them. Their refusal was not loud, not rebellious, not open defiance, but something deeper, a resistance so controlled it felt like a blade hidden beneath cloth. The quiet transformed the corridors. It unsettled the overseers. It traveled through the halls like a shadow with its own heartbeat. The women worked, prayed, suffered, and survived without a sound, turning the empire's attempt to break them into the very foundation of their strength. And as the days faded into nights and nights faded into seasons, the guards began to speak of them in hushed tones, the silent sisters beneath the palace, the ones who would not speak, the ones whose stillness felt stronger than any chain, the ones who refused to let the empire rewrite who they were. The deeper the women were driven into the heart of the palace underworld, the more the corridors seemed to twist into realms untouched by daylight, the air heavy with centuries of dust and forgotten footsteps. And it was in this labyrinth of shadowed halls that they discovered something the empire had never intended for them to find. A collapsed archway, half buried behind crates and fallen stones, its surface covered in grime as thick as the silence that surrounded it. One of the sisters brushed her fingers across the debris and felt a hollow space behind it, a faint breath of cooler air escaping like a secret long kept. With quiet determination, they cleared the rubble piece by piece, their hands trembling not from fear but from the strange certainty that whatever lay beyond was meant for them. When the last stone fell away, a small chamber revealed itself, no larger than a storage alcove, its ceiling low, its walls rough and unadorned. Yet to the sisters, it felt like the first sacred place they had seen since the fall of their monastery. The space was empty but not lifeless. It carried the stillness of ancient prayers, as though the earth itself had been waiting for a voice to fill it again. They entered the chamber with the reverence of pilgrims touching holy ground, and in that moment, a silent pact passed between them. This place would become their refuge, their chapel, their final sanctuary beneath the empire that sought to erase them. By night, when the palace slept, they returned in single file, each step a whispered defiance. They lit tiny flames using scraps of oil and shards of pottery, creating trembling points of light that danced across the rough walls like spirits awakened. Here they prayed, not in chants that echoed through grand cathedrals, but in soft murmurs barely louder than breath, prayers made fragile and strong at once by the darkness that pressed around them. Their fingers stained with soot, they took pieces of charcoal from the furnace rooms and began to draw small crosses etched into the walls, simple symbols that pulsed with meaning, each mark a testament that their faith had not been extinguished. Day by day, the walls transformed into a tapestry of devotion, black lines scratching through dust and centuries. One of the sisters, guided by memory more than certainty, carved a Latin phrase above the others. Lux in tenebris luce, the light shines in the darkness, the letters uneven yet hauntingly clear, a declaration carved in the dimness for no audience but God and time itself. Years passed and the empire shifted, guards changed, rulers rose and fell. But the tiny chapel remained untouched, sealed beneath layers of stone and silence, waiting. Until ages later, when archaeologists sifting through the ruins of the palace uncovered a narrow passage leading to a forgotten cavity in the earth. Inside they found nothing of gold or treasure, only faint crosses drawn in charcoal, a crude altar of broken pottery, a phrase in Latin barely clinging to the wall, and in that stillness they realized they had stepped into the last breath of an invisible community, a faith preserved not by power but by whispers in the dark. The palace archives were not loud. They were not cruel in the way that fire or steel is cruel. Instead, they possessed a colder and far more enduring power, a power built from ink, silence, and the steady passage of time, deep within a chamber lined with wooden shelves and bound by the scent of wax and dust. Scribes moved like shadows among countless volumes, each record etched with careful strokes, each line carrying the weight of an empire's decisions. It was here that fates were sealed. Not by judgment shouted in a court, but by the quiet scratch of a quill across a page. And it was here that the sisters were finally erased, not in fire, not in chains, but in the emptiest and most merciless way possible, under the list of palace servants where neat columns recorded names, origins, duties, and notes of transfer or disciplinary action. There lay a blank space, a hollow stretch of untouched parchment, a silence so deliberate that it screamed louder than any accusation. The scribes had left a single brief remark, a phrase delivered with bureaucratic indifference, unfit for service, removed, nothing more. No date to mark their disappearance, no destination listed, no burial location, no reason for removal, no indication that these women had ever lived, prayed, worked, or resisted. Even criminals earned lines in the records, smugglers marked with notes of restitution, thieves assigned labor, deserters listed with punishments. But the sisters were granted nothing, no identity to be traced, no story to be pieced together. They became a gap in an otherwise flawless ledger, a void too precise to be accidental. Their absence was not neglect. It was intention, a decision made at a desk where an empire reshaped truth with the steady hand of a clerk. The emptiness was its own kind of violence, a silence sharpened by authority. For what is forgotten is often more thoroughly destroyed than what is burned. A person without a name is not mourned. A life without a record is not remembered, and a disappearance without a note leaves no trail for the future to follow. The empire believed that this blank space would swallow them, that time would smooth the page like riverstone, leaving scholars centuries later with nothing to question, nothing to recover, nothing to resurrect. Yet the blankness itself became evidence, the absence too heavy, too careful, too clean. Historians who studied the archives felt the weight of that void, the way the ink seemed to step around a truth it refused to acknowledge, the way the ledger swallowed 21 lives with a single gesture. The silence pointed to a secret the empire could not bear to write. And in that hollow space the sisters were paradoxically preserved. The gap became a clue, the lack of names, a map, the missing lines, a whisper that something had happened that the empire dared not describe. And so the void became louder than any written testimony, revealing that the greatest erasure is often not done by fire or sword, but by ink that never touches the page, by a record that chooses silence over truth, by a ledger that pretends 21 souls never existed at all. The decision was made long before the girl understood that her life was not truly her own, long before she realized that in the world she was born into, a daughter was not a blessing but a burden measured in coins and obligations in a small village in medieval England, a place of cold winds and smoky hearths. Her father spent more nights inside taverns than within the walls of their home, his affection drowned beneath tankards of ale, his pride softened by drink, his purse emptied by poor choices. When the time came for his daughters to marry, he sold livestock, borrowed silver, and bargained with neighbors. But by the time he reached his youngest or nearly youngest child, his debts outweighed his prospects, and the only currency he still possessed was her future. Whispers reached him that the church offered coin for girls willing or unwilling to take the veil, a quiet transaction that solved two problems at once: a father relieved of financial duty and a church supplied with another obedient soul. One evening he stumbled home reeking of ale and called her to him with a softness that made her uneasy. He touched her cheek, told her that God would take care of her, told her this was the best path, the kindest path, the only path left. The next morning men from the church arrived, not cruel but firm, their robes brushing against the dirt floors. They took her by the wrist. Her father watched with an expression neither proud nor guilty, only relieved, and with the pouch of silver in his coat he returned to the tavern. Before the sun fully rose, the girl was brought to the convent gates, still dizzy with confusion, her feet stumbling over stones, her mouth too dry to form questions. Within the walls the air smelled of cold stone and incense, a scent that felt nothing like holiness and everything like confinement. She was led to a small chamber, lit by a single narrow window, instructed to kneel, told to bow her head. She felt hands on her shoulders, the presence of strangers moving around her, the flicker of a candle casting trembling shadows across the walls. Then she heard the scrape of metal, a sound that made her stomach twist. Before she could fully speak or resist, the first lock of her hair fell drifting past her shoulder to the floor. Another followed, then another, each cut a quiet theft, soft strands landing in a growing pile at her knees. The hair that had once been brushed by sunlight now lay lifeless like sheaves of wheat cut before harvest. Her identity stripped not with cruelty but with efficiency. Her beauty and her freedom taken with the calm rhythm of practiced hands. She felt her scalp exposed to the chill air, felt tears she refused to let fall. The ceremony lasted less than an hour. Yet it carved a before and after into her existence more sharply than any blade. When it ended, she was handed a coarse black garment that smelled of damp cloth and cold ash, told to put it on and leave her old life behind. But as she looked down at the hair scattered around her feet, she understood that she had not left her life. It had been taken from her, sold for silver, traded for ale, bartered away in a world where her voice mattered less than a coin pressed into a drunkard's palm. And for the first time, she understood what it meant to be powerless in the hands of those who believed they had the right to decide her fate. He first appeared to her as a rare flicker of mercy in a world that had shown her nothing but cold stone and harsher voices, a high churchman draped in rich fabric and soft authority, stepping between her and a punishment that might have broken her body. He spoke calmly, almost tenderly, telling the others that compassion was a virtue, that zeal without wisdom was a danger, that the girl deserved guidance, not torment. And when he lifted her sentence, she felt something she had nearly forgotten, the fragile trembling of hope, a belief that perhaps goodness still existed beneath the weight of rules and rituals. But mercy can be the most deceptive mask, and predators often approach with gentle voices, not claws. That night when she walked through the dim corridor outside the refectory, her steps slow and careful, the shadows seemed thicker than usual, the air heavier. And from that darkness, the churchman emerged again, his voice soft as before, yet sharpened with intention. He reminded her of what he had spared her, of the suffering he had lifted, of the gratitude she owed. She tried to step back, but the narrow walls closed in around her like the ribs of a cage. He whispered that forgiveness from men has a price. A whisper that froze her breath and stole the meaning from the candlelight flickering behind him. She pleaded, not loudly, just enough for the fear to tremble in her throat, but the corridor swallowed her voice as though it had been waiting for this moment. And and what happened next stripped from her not only safety but the last thread of belonging she had clung to. Afterward, she carried the silence within her like a shadow, moving through each day with motions learned from habit rather than will, her body obeying tasks while her spirit receded into a distant corner of herself. Weeks passed quietly, and then one morning in the half-light of dawn, she pressed a hand against her stomach and knew, not with reasoning, but with the certainty of a storm approaching. The sisters noticed first with whispers, then with alarm, and soon the entire convent sat like a stirred hive, buzzing with judgment. No one asked her what had happened. No one sought truth. They did not need truth. They only needed someone to bear shame so the institution itself could remain pure in its own eyes. She was dragged into the courtyard where villagers and sisters gathered, their faces arranged into masks of outrage, hunger for spectacle glittering beneath their righteousness. She was forced to kneel, her head pushed low, her hands trembling against the dirt as demands for confession fell upon her like stones. She tried to speak truth, but the words choked in her throat because she knew no one would believe her. They needed a sinner, not a victim, and she became exactly what they required. She repeated their accusations in her own voice, each word cutting deeper than any punishment could. The true offender stood among the clergy with a serene expression, his hands folded in quiet dignity, untouched, unquestioned, watching her humiliation as if it were a ritual. Unfolding precisely as intended, the villagers murmured in satisfaction, convinced that justice had been served, that order had been restored, while the girl felt the last of her hope wither, not because of the punishment, not because of the shame, but because she finally understood a truth more devastating than any cruelty, that in this world, holiness could be used as a shield for the powerful, that virtue could be performed rather than lived, and that the most dangerous monsters were those who sinned while wearing the robes of the righteous. She left the convent not as a sinner or a rebel, but as something far more fragile, a young woman stripped of name and dignity, carrying a life she had never chosen and a burden the world insisted was her own fault. The gates closed behind her with a finality that felt like a sentence. The villagers turned their backs. Her father refused even to look at her, and from that moment she walked through the world as if made of smoke, present yet unseen, alive yet already fading. She found shelter first in animal sheds, where the breath of cattle warmed the air more kindly than any human hand. The straw beneath her felt softer than the cold stone floors of the convent, though every night she curled her arms around her belly as if trying to protect the child from the judgment of the world. She survived by trading labor for scraps, cleaning barns, scrubbing pots, carrying water through mud that swallowed her footsteps, each task stripping another layer from her former self until she no longer remembered the girl she once was, only the shadow she had become. Eventually, she reached the outskirts of noble estates, where servants whispered about her with pity or disdain, but necessity forced them to place a broom in her hand and point her toward the chambers where noble travelers left behind dirt and waste. She cleaned quietly, head bowed, her swollen body trembling after long hours bent in cold halls, her hands cracked from harsh water. Yet she never complained because she had long learned that suffering had no audience willing to listen. As months passed, her breath grew shorter, her strength thinner, and when the plague crept into the city like a silent tide, she felt it. Before she understood it, the fever arrived, swiftly burning through her already weakened body, her vision blurring in the dim corners of the servants' quarters. No healer came, no priest whispered final comfort, no friend held her hand. The ones who noticed backed away in fear, and the ones who did not care let her collapse quietly onto a straw mattress that was never meant for sleep. When her final breath faded, it left no echo, no cry, no record, only the stillness of a life that had been burdened. From the moment she was sold, her body was taken away, not with reverence, but with routine, lifted by gloved hands and carried through deserted streets where doors slammed shut at the sight of the plague workers. The graveyard had no marked places left. The earth had swallowed too many too quickly, so the dead were taken to a deep trench outside the city, a trench meant not for remembrance, but for efficiency. There, without prayer or pause, her body was let go, joining countless others claimed by the same darkness. The wind carried no hymn, the sky offered no sign, and the world moved on as if she had never existed. Yet her story lingered, a quiet, haunting truth carried by those who dared to speak it, that nothing in her life had been as terrifying or destructive as being forced into holiness she never chose, that the greatest suffering she endured did not come from plague or hunger or cold, but from a system that crushed the powerless beneath the weight of its righteousness. And in the end, the bitter truth remained. The most dangerous fate in her world was not sin or sickness, but becoming a nun against her will.